Right now, on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor, the sun is doing what it has done every single day for 5,000 years. It is turning the sand into something you cannot touch with a bare hand. By early afternoon, temperatures in the Egyptian desert can climb past 43 degrees Celsius, while at night they can drop close to freezing. No civilization in human history built more in a harsher climate and kept it running for longer. Ancient Egypt lasted over 3,000 years. That is more than 15 times the age of the United States. And they did it all without a single fan, a single block of ice, or a single pane of glass. So how did people survive? Not just survive, but farm, build pyramids, raise children, fall in love, and grow old. In one of the hottest places on Earth? The answer is that the Egyptians didn't fight the desert. They studied it, and then they outthought it. Let's walk through their day. You wake before the light does, because the light is the enemy, and the only way to win against it is to get ahead of it. Egyptian houses, even the simplest mud brick homes of farmers and laborers, were built with this fact baked into their architecture. Walls were thick, sometimes more than half a meter, made of mud brick dried in the sun. Mud brick has a strange and useful property. It soaks up heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly at night, which means the inside of a house lags behind the outside world by hours. While the desert outside is already blistering by mid-morning, the inside of your home is still holding on to the coolness of the night before. Modern researchers who have measured this say that interior temperatures in well-built ancient Egyptian homes barely fluctuated at all between summer and winter, staying close to a steady, livable range no matter what was happening outside the door. Windows were small and set high on the wall, just below the roofline. This was not a design limitation. It was the opposite. A small high window lets in light and lets hot air escape upward without letting in the worst of the glare, the dust, or the heat radiating off the ground. Doorways and windows were often hung with woven reed mats, and the mats were kept damp. As the desert wind passed through the wet reeds, it cooled down and picked up moisture before it ever reached your skin. This is, essentially, an evaporative cooler, the same principle behind a modern swamp cooler, built from nothing but reeds and river water, thousands of years before anyone understood the physics behind it. Then there was the roof. Most homes had flat roofs, and by the height of the New Kingdom, families used them constantly, not for storage, but for living. The roof at midday was abandoned, the hottest, most useless real estate in the house. But the roof at night, once the mud brick below had released its stored heat and the desert air had gone cool and dry, became the best room in the home. Families would carry sleeping mats up a narrow stairway and lie out under a sky with no light pollution, sleeping where the breeze could actually reach them. An Egyptian peasant's bedroom, for half the year, was the open air. The wealthier you were, the more deliberately engineered your relief became. Some of the finer homes used a device called a Malqaf, a tall, triangular wind catcher built into the roof, angled to face the prevailing northern breeze that blows steadily off the Mediterranean and down the Nile Valley. The Malqaf would catch that wind high above the rooftops, where it was cleanest and coolest, and funnel it straight down into the rooms below, sometimes passing it over water jars on the way down so it picked up moisture before it reached you. It is, in function, an air conditioner with no moving parts and no electricity, built from stone and the simple fact that wind likes to take the path you give it. The actual workday in ancient Egypt did not look like ours, and it especially did not look like the sunrise to sunset no breaks grind that people sometimes imagine when they picture ancient labor. Our best record of ordinary working life comes from a village called Deir El-Medina, home to the artisans who carved and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Their schedule, recorded on thousands of broken pottery shards used as scrap paper, shows an 8-day workweek followed by 2 days of rest, with an hour set aside in the middle of the day for lunch. And in practice, those rest days multiplied. Religious festivals, family emergencies, a wife's argument, a hangover, an illness. All of these show up in the actual attendance records as legitimate reasons to stay home, and nobody on payroll seemed bothered by it. Across one stretch of 50 days, The records show the men of Deir El-Medina actually working only about 18 of them. The rest of the time went to festivals, brewing beer, weaving cloth, building their own tombs, or simply resting through the worst of the heat. The work itself started early, while the morning was still tolerable, and it was already beginning to wind down by the time the sun reached its highest, most dangerous point. Egyptians built their working hours around the heat the same way they built their homes around it, not by enduring the worst part of the day, but by simply declining to be in it. Clothing did its own quiet work all morning long. Linen, woven from the flax that grew thick along the Nile's floodplain, was the fabric of choice for almost everyone, rich or poor. It was light, breathable, and almost always worn in white or undyed shades, which reflected sunlight instead of absorbing it the way darker fabrics do. Men typically wore a simple kilt, the shenty, wrapped around the waist. Women wore long, loose linen sheaths or dresses. The wealthy wore it finer and more pleated. The poor wore it coarser. But everyone, from the pharaoh down to the field hand, dressed for the climate rather than for modesty alone. Clothing in Egypt was never about hiding the body. It was a piece of engineering for living in heat. And then there is the eyes. If you have ever seen Egyptian art, you have seen the thick black lines drawn around the eyes of nearly every figure, god and human alike. We tend to read this today as fashion or ritual, and it was both of those things, but it was also function. Kohl, made from ground galena or other minerals, cut down the glare bouncing up off the pale desert sand. The same basic idea as the black eye grease athletes wear under stadium lights today. Egyptian medical texts also describe kohl and related ointments being used to fight off eye infections, which were a real and constant danger in a dry, dusty climate full of biting insects near stagnant water. The eyeliner was makeup. It was also sunglasses. It was also medicine. This is when the desert truly turns hostile, and the Egyptians simply refused to be outside in it. The middle hours of the day were for shade, for rest, for staying still. Courtyards, found at the center of nearly every Egyptian home, no matter the owner's wealth, were built specifically for this purpose, a shaded, ventilated open space where families could sit, cook, work on small tasks, and let air move around them without standing in direct sun. Trees were planted deliberately around homes and temples for the same reason. Wealthier estates kept whole gardens of sycamore and date palm, not just for fruit, but because shade itself was a luxury worth cultivating. Water was everywhere in the conversation of staying alive, because in a climate like this, dehydration is not a discomfort. It is a death sentence. The Nile made this possible in a way that almost no other ancient civilization could match. A reliable, year-round freshwater source running through the middle of an otherwise lethal desert. Egyptians stored their drinking water in porous clay jars called kaulas, and the porousness was the trick. Water seeping slowly through the unglazed clay walls would evaporate on the outside surface, pulling heat out of the water inside and leaving it noticeably cooler than the air around it. It is the same principle as a clay pot fridge, used in parts of the world to this day. Beer, brewed thick and only mildly alcoholic from fermented bread and grain, was also a daily staple. Not primarily for intoxication, but because fermentation made it safer to drink than untreated river water, and it carried real caloric and nutritional value that helped sustain people through hard physical labor in extreme heat. Perfume played its own strange role in surviving the climate. Wealthier Egyptians, especially women, wore small cones on top of their wigs or shaved heads, made from a blend of fat or wax mixed with fragrant resins like myrrh. As the day's heat built, the cone would slowly melt, releasing scent, and, by some accounts, letting a thin trickle of cooling scented oil run down over the scalp and shoulders. Whether this was mostly ceremonial or mostly practical is still debated by historians, but either way, it tells you something about a culture that had built an entire aesthetic ritual around the management of heat on the human body. By the time the worst of the heat begins to break, the rhythm of the day starts to pick back up. Farmers who had spent the morning working the fields along the Nile's edge returned to check on canals and irrigation channels. Egypt never had Rome's aqueducts, but it built an extraordinarily effective network of canals that pulled water from the Nile's annual flood and pushed it out across the land. The entire economy of the civilization quite literally running on a flood cycle the Egyptians learned to predict with remarkable precision. Tending that system was a year-round generational task, but the heaviest of it was scheduled, like everything else, around the times of day a person could actually survive standing in the sun. This is also when the major building projects moved forward. The construction of temples, tombs, and monuments that still stand today. It's worth pausing on how those workers too organized themselves around the desert rather than against it. Excavated workers' villages near the pyramids show evidence of housing, bakeries, breweries, and medical care built specifically to support large labor forces through long projects, with food and beer rationed out daily as something closer to a wage than a gift. These were not slaves dying under the whip in the noon sun, as popular imagination sometimes insists. They were organized, fed, paid laborers working in shifts, with rest periods built into the structure of the job, in a system the Egyptian state had every incentive to keep functional for decades at a time, because pyramids took decades to build. This is when the city, the village, the home, finally exhales. The sun drops, the mud brick that has been quietly absorbing heat all day finally starts to give some of it back to the cooling night air, and life returns outdoors. Cooking happens in courtyards over small fires, bread baked in conical clay ovens, onions and beans and fish from the Nile prepared for the evening meal. Families who spent the brutal midday hours separated into shaded corners of the house come back together. The roof, empty and useless at noon, becomes the gathering place at dusk. People sit out under a sky with no artificial light to compete with it, the same stars their ancestors had been reading for 3,000 years. Religious life threaded through all of this, and it was not separate from the practical business of surviving the climate. It was bound up in it. Egyptian time itself was organized around the flood cycle of the Nile, which the Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons around. Akhet, the season of inundation, when the river rose and flooded the fields. Peret, the growing season, when the water receded and crops were planted in the newly enriched soil. And Shemu, the harvest and the dry season, the hottest stretch of the year, when the canals ran low and the desert pressed hardest against daily life. Festivals were not random breaks from work. They were scheduled around this cycle, clustering through the year in ways that gave people rest at precisely the moments the climate demanded it. None of this made the Egyptian desert gentle. People still died of heat stroke, of dehydration, of the diseases that come with biting insects near stagnant irrigation water. Infant mortality was brutal by modern standards. A bad flood year could mean famine across the entire kingdom, no matter how clever anyone had been about wind catchers and clay jars. The Egyptians were not living some perfected harmony with their climate. They were locked in a long, patient negotiation with it, one they mostly won by refusing to fight it directly. And that's really the whole shape of the story. Nothing about how the Egyptians survived their desert involved brute forcing the heat with raw effort or raw technology. It involved noticing, with extraordinary patience, exactly how heat moves, through mud brick, through wind, through wet reeds, through a clay jar's pores, and then building an entire civilization's daily rhythm around those small, exploitable truths. They worked when the day allowed it and rested when it didn't. They built homes that did half the work of staying cool without anyone lifting a finger after the bricks were laid. They dressed, ate, and even decorated themselves in ways that doubled as survival gear. We live in climate-controlled boxes now, heated and cooled at the flip of a switch, and most of us could not tell you which direction the prevailing wind blows past our own front door. The Egyptians could, because their lives depended on it. They never beat the desert. They just learned, over 3,000 patient years, exactly how to live inside it.